We've heard everything from police reform to defund the police to all cops are bad and back the blue. But what does it all mean? And do we even have a police problem at all? The year 2020 was, in every essence of the word, hell. We endured the outbreak of a new deadly disease. We witnessed the worst reality TV show in history. And for 9 minutes and 28 seconds, we watched a deliberate and drawn-out excessive use of force on a helpless black man. The death of George Floyd sparked a nation into protests, riots, debate, and even more partisanship. But the simple fact is this. In this country, the United States of America, the concept of liberty extends to all of its citizens, and we have a right, guaranteed to us by our Constitution, to have any grievances challenged in court, be it by judge or jury. We, under that same Constitution, no matter the lifestyle we live, are innocent until proven guilty. And for those who utter phrases like, "he had it coming" or "he should have complied," you are part of the problem. It doesn't matter what George Floyd's history was. It doesn't matter if he tried to use a counterfeit $20 bill or not. And it doesn't matter if he had small amounts of fentanyl in his system or not. As a citizen, he was innocent and had his right to face his accuser or charges, and for his guilt to be proven in a court of law, regardless of how clear-cut they may have been. He was denied that right by being murdered. Liberty is for everyone. It's for every elite Democrat that lives inside the Beltway, to every redneck Republican living out in the sticks. It's for every South Chicago youth and every Florida man. Liberty is blind. So do we have a police problem? Yes, but maybe not in the sense you may think. For one, not all cops are bad. In fact, a majority are pillars of their community and resonate the exceptional character required to be a civil servant. But there are those bad apples and there are those complacent or silent. Even those don't outweigh the numerous amount of good, altruistic police we have protecting and serving us. And those even come out to condemn the actions against then Officer Derek Chauvin and numerous other police infractions against their citizens. There are 5 major concerns of police activity that I would like to address. These are not all-inclusive, and there are plenty more to choose from. And none of them are directed at the police themselves or the extraordinary jobs they are entrusted to fulfill. They do, however, focus on the systems they act under and the continued over-policing policies this nation has embraced since the early 1980s. Those concerns are qualified immunity, police militarization, no-knock warrants, civil asset forfeiture, and victimless crimes. The 80s. Time of yuppies, the birth of video game consoles, great movies, and mixtapes. But behind all those mullets and acid-washed jeans, America dealt with the influx of illegal drugs. No thanks to the CIA. But before that, when hippies reigned supreme and the call to make love not war echoed, it was Tricky Dick that uttered that famous virtuous phrase, "War on drugs." Nixon was still laboring with America in Vietnam, but still turned his war effort on the youth of America. Mandatory sentencing, no-knock warrants, and a boost to the police budget rounded out his tenure. It takes an unpolluted character like him to set such hardline stances on crime. Then the Gipper himself made it a personal vendetta to ramp up the war on drugs. And he did. With the help of his wife Nancy, they turned the war on drugs into a political hysteria. It went from near utter obscurity in the mid-80s to 64% of Americans polling that it was the #1 issue in America. This fear fueled rapid expansion of police forces and escalated the interactions between officers and civilians. So, in effort to help an already expanding police force, the conservative savior turned his sights on gun rights, ushering in the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. It was in this escalation that police turned from a community relations prerogative to a full-fledged armed forces of the streets. Through all of this, violent crimes peaked in the early 90s. In fact, over the past 25 years, violent crimes are nearly half what they were then. But police funding and divisions have more than doubled over that same time period. The argument then could be that the increased policing and extraordinary growth of incarceration rates is in direct correlation with the decrease of violent crimes. But not so fast. There have been numerous studies that contradict that connection and provide numerous other metrics and statistics such as CompStat-style programs, changes in income, decreased alcohol consumption, and an aging population, just to name a few. So, with violent crime actually decreasing, why is there a perceived police problem? Well, it comes from the erosion of trust between the community and their police departments, and it's policies like the ones I mentioned that drive that distrust. Qualified immunity is a focal point throughout the country for improving those community relations with police. Qualified immunity shields government officials from financial liability when they violated a person's constitutional rights. They can still face charges and be denied qualified immunity if they violate an already clearly established law. The problem is there is so much ambiguity with this precedent that even if it is apparent that an officer violated a person's rights, it must be nearly exact to a case tried before. For instance, prior to Baxter versus Bracey, a police officer ordered a canine attack on a civilian that had already given up. That officer received qualified immunity and absolved of wrongdoing. However, the court now had deemed those actions to be excessive, which would be used to establish a baseline for the future on similar offenses, which in application should eliminate qualified immunity for any officer that engaged in those actions, which were now deemed unwarranted. A few years later, an eerily similar case presented itself when Alexander Baxter was attacked by a canine on order of the officer after he surrendered. One would think that the officer would be charged with excessive force and denied qualified immunity, but the court determined the case had enough differences to shield the officer and take no further action. This difference: the first man was lying face down. Alexander Baxter was sitting with his hands up. It is this immunity that breeds impunity for police and fosters a shoot first, think later mentality. It has led to false arrests, civil rights violations, and use of excessive force. Qualified immunity deters individual suits and subjects civil complaints to be directed at the government entity responsible for their officials' actions, typically resulting in settlements paid by the taxpayer. In fiscal year 2019, over $300 million were paid in these settlements. Cases where wrongdoing was found, the officers were absolved, but the taxpayer covered the fees. The right for civilians to sue individual government officials went into effect with the Civil Rights Act of 1871, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. Specifically, Section 1983 states that private citizens have the right to sue police officers, public educators, prison guards, wardens, and any other government official. This was a way to address the rampant racial disparity among nearly all white government officials and police and the newly freed black communities. Ironically, it was nearly 100 years later, during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that qualified immunity took hold, and the Supreme Court made it official in 1982. And ever since, the Supreme Court has been hesitant to take up or reverse qualified immunity, mostly based on fear of potential fallouts such as frivolous lawsuits, bankruptcy of local governments, and discouraging government employment. These problems are impossible to predict, and in cases where qualified immunity has been restricted, many of those have not come to fruition. And in those areas, police departments are now required to attain liability insurance, which in case of civil suit settlements, the cost burden is not redirected to the taxpayer. Whether it is to completely eliminate qualified immunity or overhaul the precedent of what actually constitutes qualified immunity, something must be done. The militarization of police has also deterred the public view. Since 1980, we've seen an increase of paramilitary tactics by over 1,400%. Though SWAT was created in the 60s, it was the 1980s war on drugs that catapulted their use and grew their ranks. It was during this time and after the 1986 Gun Restriction Act that restricted the private ownership of fully automatic weapons that police championed the need for more dangerous weapons. Detractors of this militarization would point to the escalation of situations when the absence of advanced weaponry would otherwise contribute to a peaceful resolution. Again, the war on drugs pushed for the institution of a 1990s Department of Defense 1033 program, which allows the military to sell equipment to police forces. This has garnered a $7.4 billion profit for the federal government in the purchase of machine guns, bayonets, grenade launchers, and military aircraft by local police. The current argument against police using military tactics and weaponry is that violent crimes today don't require the need for such excessive force. Criminal activity is usually carried out with handguns or non-firearm weapons, and in 2017, only 2% of all crimes incorporated the use of AR or AK-style rifles. This decrease of violent crime has led to the misuse of SWAT and other tactical teams to carry out otherwise controllable situations. They are used in 80% of search warrants conducted, which is normally carried out by capable police officers. No-knock warrants are another policy that has come under intense scrutiny recently, especially after the death of Breonna Taylor. The effort to remove this policy is picking up throughout the nation. Currently, 3 states, Oregon, Florida, and Virginia, completely ban the use of no-knock warrants, with 13 states considering the stop or restriction of its use. No-knock warrants, again, stemmed from the war on drugs. It was meant to prevent criminals from fleeing, to preserve evidence, protect the safety of officers and innocent parties. The execution of these warrants typically occurred at night to establish the element of surprise on the precedent of protecting the police. Drugs and weapons are the main target for no-knock warrants, and in many instances, no-knock warrants carried out for weapon raids occur on legally registered owners, much to the chagrin of the NRA. And only 1 in 3 SWAT raids turn up illegal weapons, and 65% of these raids for drugs come up empty. And more than 10% of the time, they occur at the wrong location altogether, meaning no-knock warrants are extremely unsuccessful and put innocent, law-abiding citizens at risk of injury, frivolous charges, or in Breonna Taylor's case, even death. They are rarely rejected by a judge, and in some cases are granted when normal warrants are requested. The requirements for such a request are completely subjective, and in many cases where it was unnecessary, they are protected by qualified immunity. For instance, in 2014, SWAT raided a home for credit card fraud. When a civil suit was submitted for excessive force, it was dismissed on the grounds that a guest who happened to be there during the raid had a handgun. That handgun was registered and carried with a valid concealed carry permit. Civil asset forfeiture is another major cog of the deteriorating trust of the public and police. This allows police to seize, keep, then sell any property they allege was involved in a crime. Owners need not be arrested or convicted of the crime. In fact, this occurs over 80% of the time. This type of legalized theft was put in practice to inflict as much damage on drug kingpins and weapons dealers. It was meant for big game criminals. The RICO funds, or the seized money and property, were then used to help fund police departments and acquire more equipment. In 42 states, more than half of all property seized goes directly back to the department for use or sell. This provides a perverse financial incentive, especially for struggling low-budget departments. These same departments usually reside in lower-income communities and communities of color. Therefore, the intended use is redirected to those who already straddle the line of poverty. They usually cannot afford to hire an attorney attorney to wade through the litany of paperwork in effort to reclaim their property, and in some nefarious instances are threatened with frivolous arrest if they do not sign a compliance for civil asset forfeiture. And these seizures expand beyond the gray area. In one case, a family's vehicle was brought into a shop for repairs. The mechanic got pulled over during a test drive. The vehicle was seized because the mechanic was driving on an expired driver's license. In another, a neighbor reported a marijuana plant to the police. When they showed up, it belonged to the homeowners, a retired couple who used it for medicinal purposes, although they did not have a license. Instead of the police seizing the contraband and charging the couple with possession, they seized their home and the 26 acres of land they owned. These questionable policies walk a fine line of constitutional infringement and overbearing police intrusion. They are starting to meet contention within the states, but need to receive more national attention. These policies continue to be enforced, and more often now are they imposed on those involved in victimless crimes. This type of illegal activity does not have an identifiable victim and is usually only associated to the person involved in said criminal activity. These crimes are usually argued under moral principles and carry a stigma of degradation. These include prostitution, assisted suicide, drug use and possession, gambling, drunkenness, public nudity, and homelessness. These types of crimes do not infringe on the liberties of others and make up a large portion of America's incarceration rate, but we'll discuss victimless crime in depth at another time. America's perceived police problem is a problem of outdated and doubled down procedure reaching back to the 1980s. These policies have blurred the constitutionality of them and caused strain on public trust. We can simply look at the rapid shift in police mentality just with the change of their daily police vehicles. A brightly colored car continuously patrolling a highway at the speed limit effectively deters speeding, because we've all slowed down a bit at the sight of a police car, regardless if we were speeding or not. This deterrent no doubt reduces potential accidents and contributes to the safety of the public. But they've continued to trade in those for a more sleek, undercover version that are harder to detect in effort to catch speeders instead of deterring them. This is profit over safety. These policies, along with others, need to be addressed. The prerogative of community relations needs to be re-implemented. Use of force re-examined, and training remodeled. Some of this nation's best men and women don the badge in an attempt to truly protect and serve the citizen. We need reform to put them in the best position to be successful and bring confidence back to their communities.